Hi everyone, this is Pat from Dime Cabaret here. This is going to be a follow-up video to the previous one that was released last week, in which I went over my general thoughts of the 2020 demo of Autumn, as well as, I guess, what we want to change going into the 2023 studio version. In that video, I also did go over my general thoughts about the electric guitar parts I wrote for that. But anyway, so this video is going to focus more, I guess, on my general arranging mindset, and I'll be going through a couple of Autumn score examples to make sense of this process that I have. So here's a PowerPoint. It's actually Google Slides, actually. In a similar vein to what Brandon said in a previous Instagram reel, there's a lot happening in these tracks, and there's a lot of moving parts. So the only way to keep this well-oiled machine from running smoothly and not derailing and becoming an utter mess is to only include additional parts that feel necessary. And what's necessary is quite subjective, but I suppose what we feel is necessary for a song is whether that additional part largely contributes to an overall vibe or soundscape. And I guess if we got rid of those parts, will it make or break the song? It's funny enough, though, I guess. I could, make a really fancy arrangement of, with adding piano and strings and make it as time or culturally appropriate as possible. But then we have electric guitars. I felt like I should mention that a lot of composers, arrangers, and producers will solely use additional orchestrations to pad out the existing material that's already in the arrangement. That's totally cool, but I guess for Black Dime, we don't necessarily go with that approach. We generally want any kind of orchestrations that we have to sort of sit at the foreground where appropriate. It's not to say we haven't had those moments in Act 1. Like, for example, in Ode to Lady Midnight, it's kind of a metal ballroom kind of track. If you ever listen to the original 2020 demo, there was a kind of a death metal scream at one point, which is still pretty funny. But in the new version, I arranged a string quartet for it. They aren't really the focus. There's a couple moments where they're kind of a little bit more in your face, but for the most part, like in the choruses, they really much are there to just reinforce what's there. That being the piano part, as well as, I made the cello also play the same thing as Luke's bass. So, just putting it out there that, it's very common to use additional orchestrations to pad out and just sort of layer on from what's already there in the arrangement. But again, in Black Dime Cabaret music, we sometimes will push to the forefront. So it kind of exists as its own thing. Alright, so before I go into the score examples and everything, I figured it made more sense to just quickly talk about just my approach to arranging. These are questions I ask myself quite a lot when I'm in the process of it. Well, okay, over the years, I've heard this phrase being thrown around so much, less is more, not just in music, in writing, it's used in pretty much near damn every other art form, as well as sometimes in general lifestyle advice. I freaking hated it when I was younger and in my more edgy, rebellious phases. At this stage, though, I can agree on it, at least at its core, and at least what I believe to be its core, which is it's actually a lesson in efficiency. How I think about it nowadays is if you have a particular idea you'd like to express, try to do it with as little means as possible. Because I guess before, when I heard this phrase, it'd be sort of in the vein of like, oh, you're doing too much. You're overcomplicating things. Just make it really simple. And I don't necessarily think it should be treated like that. I don't think it's a license to keep things diatonic. I don't think it's a license to keep things as, one single bass note per bar or per chord, or, chucking the snare on beats 2 and 4. it's not a license to kind of do the bare minimum and then say that, yeah, it's done. I think you kind of need to experiment a bit more, see what works, and then go, all right, are there any sort of things I can trim the fat off of? And not to say, you have to keep music not diatonic or anything, because if you want something to be slightly easy listening or just kind of pleasant to listen to, most people are going to listen to something that's diatonic and go, yeah, nothing is inoffensive to the ears. There's no real strong dissonances or anything. The bass line example of the single bass note on the guitar for every chord. I mean, you might not want a lot of movement in the bass because you want it to be you want the bass to be very minimal because there's a lot happening, or you just want there to be a little bit more, an initial boom for every chord, and then just let it taper out. And for the drum example, putting snare on beat 2 and 4, maybe you really want the strong backbeat sound. You want to kind of create I guess like a disco beat dance groove or something, then that's totally fine. Then all those examples make it a reasonable thing to do and a well-intended thing to do. And I guess that kind of leads me on to that second question I have there, and it's, have I achieved something structurally, emotionally by, the inclusion of this instrument part? Anything structural to me is whether it reinforces the harmony or kind of cements a particular groove. On the emotional side, it's really if it just contributes to the overall vibe of the song. And I realized though when I was writing this question, it's not really that black and white, not so binary. How you choose to implement an instrument on a structural level is going to affect the emotional outcome, and vice versa. Again, I guess doesn't feel necessary. And this next question, I guess, may or may not really matter to a lot of people or a lot of arrangers. When I'm working with MIDI samples, MIDI instruments, I'm not overly concerned with realism, but I will still err on the side of trying to write as idiomatically and as realistic as possible. So regardless of the instrument, I'm always going to try to make the part playable. In addition to that, I really do want to tap into as much of the sonic characteristics of that instrument I possibly can, all within the scope of what is reasonable for the song that I'm writing or the song that I'm arranging for. And if you are going to write for an instrument that you don't know how to play, I would recommend at least taking a bit of time to research and get a better understanding of how to play it, at least at the theoretical level. You don't necessarily need to pick it up and actually play it. It would be good if you could, but I think that will help you write more realistically. And, things that you'd at least probably should know at a baseline level is, the standard note range of the instrument, as well as, common playing techniques. And, you can go a little bit more in depth, with that standard note range. Most instruments have a different kind of timbre depending on what part of the range you are playing. With the violin, the higher registers, the higher notes are going to sound very shrill and piercing, whereas, the lower string and the really low ones are going to be a little bit warm, but then, it's not going to be the same as a cello. It's not going to be as bodied as a viola or a cello. And then, other more spicy techniques to spice up the whole arrangement. Also listening or, even reading scores of how the part usually functions in arrangements can be quite useful. So you're not writing a part that feels like it could be played by another instrument. That's something that I will sometimes still do. I realized this early on though, but I actually really like writing interesting or fun parts to play for every instrument. So if it's a string quartet, I don't really like kind of going really heavy on the violin and then the second violin just gets nothing. I kind of like to divvy it up a little bit more so that the violin too feels like they're not necessarily just only playing second fiddle. In most cases they should be, but I still try to make that second violin part a little bit fun to play at least. So I guess it's not uncommon for me to write parts that are a little bit closer to the higher end of the difficulty scale, as opposed to parts that are just piss easy. And besides the fact of trying to make parts as interesting and fun as possible to play, it's not like I'm outright going for a really complex sound from the get-go. usually what you're listening to, and usually how I go through my arranging process, I'm revising that part like at least 2 or 3 times, and I'm adding things in certain places and then taking things out or just completely revising it. Okay, now we finally got to the second part of the video. Here on out, I'm just going to be going over specific examples in Autumn about parts that I thought were interesting to talk about. So the first thing I'd like to bring your attention to is the intro, and it's the pizzicatos that you hear at the very start of Autumn. It might look very random on the score, as you can sort of see. I think you can see the mouse, but there is a bit more method to it. It's not just everywhere. It's actually kind of loosely based off Brand's guitar part, and all I'm really doing is, as I mentioned previously about trying to make parts fun, I've just spread out this across the whole string quartet. So, you know, like violin 1 could very well be playing what violin 2 is. It could be playing both the parts, but I opted to kind of split the part anyway because it kind of creates this nice pseudo stereo ping pong effect as you hear the notes being played from 2 different sources, as opposed to just the one violin. And violin 1 will sound different from violin 2 for a number of different reasons, like where they are situated in the room, the violins they're actually using, and I guess the player skill and their intonation. So you're going to get a slightly different sound out of those pizzicatos that you wouldn't necessarily get otherwise if just one of the violins were playing them. And so yeah, the stereo ping pong effect is kind of what I was trying to achieve here, and this is kind of what it sounds like. Now, I guess the pre-choruses are this bit. So earlier on, there actually was only going to be one violin. It was kind of during writing Autumn that I started trying to write for a whole string quartet, actually. So this is one of the first songs where I tried to write a string quartet for. I asked what Brandon wanted, like how did he wanted the overall sound of the strings to go, and all he said was just bell reprisal and say no more. Just kidding. It wasn't as simple as that. I went through a lot of revisions. But yeah, so I guess this is kind of my take on, I guess, that direction. Here's how this bit sounds. Very small part. It's literally only like 2 bars going into each of the choruses. But the idea was to make it sort of have this rising action. Okay, when I'm working with a string quartet, I really do try to make every single member of that quartet play something different. If you make every member of that string quartet play the exact same thing, potentially at the same octave, you're going to get a very, very thin sound, as all the instruments are just going to blend way too much to the point where they almost start to become indistinguishable, and that's what leads to that thin sound. The different parts sounding different from each other, that's what creates it a larger sound because of that small amount of distance that you're getting from all that. If you look at all the voicings, right, even in like both choruses, this is the final chorus at the bottom, this is the first 2 choruses at the top. You know, the violin is going up, violin 2 is going up as well, cello's going up, but the viola is actually going down. And just that little bit of contrary motion is going to stop all the parts sounding too samey, and it's going to open up the overall arrangement when it gets to the chorus a bit more. So it sounds a bit bigger, just from that little bit alone. So bottom line here, if you're going to write for all these instruments, just try to write individual parts for all of them. You're going to get better results as opposed to just copying and pasting the exact same thing for each of the instruments, but just varying up the octaves. I don't think going into contrary motion is going to be very smart for a 10 to 15 minute video. Try to make some instruments resolve or move upwards in the next note, and have some instruments go down in the next notes. It will make for a larger sound. Otherwise, if everything's kind of moving up or resolving, transitioning to a higher note, you're going to get a very unified sound, which, you know, could be very well what you need in a particular moment, but it's also, again, going to create a very thin sound due to a bunch of music theory, parallel octaves, fifths, and yada yada, which just search it up. It is worth your time if you do. You know, that's kind of really all I have to say about the strings, to be honest. Just make sure you're writing unique parts for every single member of the string quartet. For the piano, I've got a bit more to say because I'm probably a bit more familiar with how to write for that. For the chorus, this is how it sounds. guess it's a bridge between what the strings are playing and just the overall arrangement as a whole. One thing that the original 2020 demo was maybe a bit lacking in the choruses, because of the distortion guitar was very, very prominent in the mix, it sounded kind of a bit aggressive. And so one way I was going to address that in this version is kind of making the piano and the strings be a little bit more gentle and be a bit playful. And so you get a lot of the playfulness in it in this 2023 version from that piano, as it kind of acts as a counter melody to what the vocals are doing. Though, to be more specific about just like the actual arranging of it, 3 to 4 note per hand chords, they sound really great in isolation, but the issue is if you put them in a very dense arrangement, as you know, BDC arrangements are very dense, they're just going to take up way too much space and just mask and muddy up the whole arrangement. Especially the left hand, it's going to kind of compete for the same sort of space as the bass. And then you're just not going to hear either of them very well. What I kind of came up with at this point was pretty much typically how I would arrange for a piano in an arrangement like this. I try to just keep it to 1 or 2 notes in the left hand, and then maybe 1 to 3 notes in the right hand at any kind of given beat, bar, moment, whatever in time. That just keeps it lean, but you still get enough information out of the piano. The piano bridge, at this point of the song, it shifts gears into a more like rock anthem kind of sound. You know, all the gentleness of that piano kind of needs to be not there at this point. It kind of also can't be doing too much of its own kind of thing. You know, at this point, we want the electric guitar, the drums, and the strings to take center stage. I ignore the pun that I made in this PowerPoint, please. Here's how it also sounds with the strings and piano together. With the piano, it's taking a bit more of a background role. It's really just doubling what the strings are doing, especially the left hand with the violoncello, and then with the right hand, it's playing a bit of what the violins are doing, but also harmonizing a little bit on top of that. And, you know, I've just added a couple of what I like to call chord spams on the accents of the bar, just to add more momentum and urgency to this section. Honestly, I don't have a lot to say about the instrumental break, except for the fact that I really freaking love it. This is my favorite bit in Autumn. There's a couple of reasons why I like it, because again, I'm playing around with trying to make the parts as fun as possible across the string quartet, and it has this is kind of a sneak peek into one of the Act 2 songs, actually. There's a motif that's used here in the piano that you will hopefully recognize when Act 2 rolls around. I'm going to cap off this video with just an A, B, and C. The 2020 version first, the instrumental break as it is here, and then the studio version at the very end. So that is going to be it for this 2-part series about arranging autumn. As always, I hope that was a little bit interesting and I didn't bore you to death with this PowerPoint. And really, as I'm just kind of finishing off this video, it's been interesting making this video. I am by no means an expert. As much as I did say these are the questions I asked myself when arranging, those questions are very much during the later phases of my arranging process. Honestly, when I work on this and when I start, I kind of just do whatever, to be honest. And then I ask questions later about whether they are particularly beneficial or not. So I don't want to give anyone the impression that you need to have it all figured out to begin with. I think it's a very, very scary thing to do, to have something planned out 100%. Some planning's good, but I guess in my case, I really do just I kind of just act and then ask questions a bit later when it comes to arranging. But anyway, maybe I'll be going over maybe some guitar parts, like proper playthroughs of them, maybe a couple. I know I'll be going over defaults eventually, but that's neither here nor there. So either way, have a good day, and until next time, see ya.